Um, isn't this a wonderful time of the year? It's one of my favorites. Uh, until I stand out there without a coat on. Um, Samhain, the Celtic festival that marks the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter, honors the ancestors and celebrates the thinning of the veil between the living and the dead worlds. Samhain also gave us the sweetest of all celebrations, carving pumpkins and gathering a harvest of candy. Hey. Many indigenous held harvest festivals as a celebration marking the end of the harvesting season and to give thanks for the crops gathered and to pray for continued fertility of the land. It was a time when the clans and families gathered back together up and after the summer of travel, trading, and following the herds. Families gathered together to share their bounties and butchered to make preparation for the hardships of winter. Mother Nature, by example, encourages us to celebrate the end of summer with wonderful colors, reminding us that this is the time of letting go, resting, gathering our strength and energy to begin the cycle again in spring. Our past creates the foundation that brings us to our present. The past is a time we can reflect on, be in good memories or bad. Some may be very painful, filled with trials, hardships, injustices, disappointments, and loss. Some may be lovely memories, filled with love, joy, and compassion. Bless you. We may have regrets or things we should or would have done differently. But the past, being what it is past, and we cannot change it. Oscar Wilde said, "The one charm of the past is that it is the past." The past cannot be changed, only learned from and built upon. What we choose to do with those lessons will determine how we live our present. The choices we make in the present will shape our future. Our reading this morning is from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Advice for Living. I am convinced that love is the most durable power in the world. It is not an expression of impractical idealism, but of practical realism. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, love is an absolute necessity for the survival of our civilization. To return hate for hate does nothing but intensify the existence of evil in the universe. Someone must have sense enough and religion enough to cut off the chain of hate and evil, and this can only be done through love. Moreover, love is creative and redemptive. Love builds up and unites, hate tears down and destroys. The aftermath of the fight fire with fire method, which you suggest is bitterness and chaos, the aftermath of the love method is reconciliation and the creation of a beloved community. Physical force can repress, restrain, coerce, destroy, but it cannot create and organize anything permanent. Only love can do that. Yes, love, which means understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill, even for one's enemies, is the solution of the race problem. Often love is crucified and buried in a grave, but in the long run, it rises up and redeems even that which crucifies it.
Our second reading is a poem by Seamus Heaney titled The Cure of Troy. Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. The innocent in jails beat on their bars together. A hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard dumb. The police widow in veils faints at the funeral home. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles, in cures, and healing wells. Call miracle self-healing, the utter self-revealing, double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term. It means once in a lifetime that justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. In 2 days, our nation will face one of the most consequential moral reckonings in our history. For nearly 2.5 centuries, this country has struggled, stumbled, and yet steadily strove forward toward becoming a more perfect union. Along the way, our unity has been tested. We have come to many crossroads that have tested the courage and resolve of knowing who we are and expanding who we mean when we say we. We, the people, has meant different things in different eras of our country's fraught history. But in a couple days, we, the people, all of us, will test once more the integrity, vitality, and viability of our great democratic endeavor. With this in mind, as I'm guessing the significance is not lost on any of our minds here today, we are left to consider what can be said at this 11th hour to orient and fortify us for this coming this week. I thought back to where I was 8 years ago when we stood at a different threshold. Now, I'm not sure what was going on here in Indiana, but where I was living in Minnesota, there was an air of confidence going into those final days of the campaign. There was a belief that the United States was ready to choose love over hate, unity over division, and a multicultural future over a white supremacist past. Last, we know what came next. The nation entered a dystopian era of indiscriminate cruelty, of collective trauma, and a most unnerving inability to know whether, and if so, when, an end to the madness might come. I don't wish to dwell on the election from 8 years ago. We have enough to dwell on here. But I do want to note one more thing that may be helpful to us in our fortification and preparation for what is to come. One thing I recall from 2016 is how naively confident I was about the outcome of the election. I think many of us were. In fact, I read many articles after the fact about how shocked large swaths of the population were, especially liberal white people. Indeed, there was a bit of a wake-up call to what Black Americans in particular saw from miles away, that white supremacy and patriarchy were alive and well. In the years that followed, our nation faced some of the most awful reckonings in modern history, including the Muslim ban, migrant child separation policy, police brutality, COVID, January 6th, the Dobbs decision, the emboldened resurgence of fascism and white Christian nationalism, and the list goes on. Each of these events peeled back a layer of truth to the challenges we still face as a nation. They also were like ripping off Band-Aids of innocence for those of us with more privileged identities and awareness of some of the ugliness of our inhumanity that many people of color and those from other marginalized identities have warned us about, that they warned us about back in 2016. In other words, over the past 8 years, we have been in a literal crash course as a nation about the horrors that still stand between us and this more perfect union we hope to live into one day. Recalling these memories and current day realities sets the backdrop for some of the stakes in this election. It is important to orient us to where we are if we are to move forward with hope and courage. To fortify us, I want to turn to our Unitarian Universalist shared values, which we've been exploring over the past month. With justice the theme for today, I turn to its progenitor, which is love. Justice comes from love. In fact, all of life, or what should be called life, comes from love. Dr. Cornel West says, justice is what love looks like in public. In the language of our shared value of justice, we are called to create, quote, diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. Notice the essential quality that characterizes the community we seek to build together. Beloved. Beloved. Not just diverse, multicultural community, but diverse, multicultural, beloved community. That love, which we have said is at the center of who we are, and that which will guide us through the hard night before us, is complicated. It's a complicated qualifier, to say the least. There has been some controversy, you see, around love, namely whether love is strong enough to hold the center or big enough to guide us in times of not just joy, but sorrow as well. Really, this debate about love has been going on for generations. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who birthed and popularized our cultural imaginary of the beloved community, was perhaps the most critiqued champion of love in the 21st century. In the reading Lynn read this morning, the words by Dr. King were actually a response to a question in an interview for Ebony magazine. In the November 1957 issue, when the then 28-year-old civil rights leader was asked this question, quote, "Is love really the solution to the race problem? Are there not times when a man must stand up and fight fire with fire? I will grant that love as Jesus lived it is the ultimate ideal, but it seems to me preachers ought to be honest and tell folks if they live by the turn the other cheek doctrine, the sharp boys out here in this cold world will strip them and boil them in oil. Why don't you preachers admit that love, in the highest sense of the word, is impractical in the world of today?" End quote. Well, this is quite the hard-hitting question, but of course, Dr. King was not fazed at all. Likely it not being the first time he was asked the question, nor would it be the last. In response to that question, he shares, quote, "I am convinced that love is the most durable power of the world. It is not an expression of impractical idealism, but of practical realism, end quote. As a creative and redemptive force, Dr. King affirms something that I believe we as Unitarian Universalists are coming to realize, coming to appreciate and practice in our day-to-day lives. Love is tried and true, reliable and ready to orient, fortify, and guide us. The problem is that love is sometimes discredited before it even has a chance to do so. It can be easy in the face of such violence, division, and fear to lift up love when it is hard to lift up love in the face of violence, division, and fear when it has been distorted, diminished, and partitioned to the side rather than to the center of our lives. But I believe justice will only come from our centering of love, that our resilience will only come from returning love to the center of who we are and how we live our values out in the world. Indeed, I think resilience, justice, and love are interdependent, which is another one of our shared values we talked about a couple weeks ago. The Unitarian Universalist Association is a step ahead, thankfully, and seeking to support us here in Columbus and Southern Indiana and other UU congregations across the nation as we orient, fortify, and move forward in the days to come. They have created something called a Community Resilience Hub, which is a nice acronym for those familiar with CRH. The Community Resilience Hub provides both resources and community to build shared solidarity across UU congregations and with our partners in our local contexts. I want to share a video with you. It's about 5 minutes long, so buckle up. And it's a little bit of an overview of how we might engage within this network of resilience, justice, and love.
Beloveds, we know that the time between now and the election, as well as the weeks following November 5th, have significant potential for increased disinformation, chaos, and even violence in our country. While Unitarian Universalist congregations are not likely to be primary targets at this time, we know that many of our communities are in hotspots where both our members and our neighbors are likely to be at increased risk. This is particularly true for migrants, for trans and non-binary people, for queer folks, and for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities.
While it sounds simple, the first and most important thing you can do right now is to be in communication with one another. Check in with your people. Make sure they're okay. Keep the lines of communication open. We've learned some hard lessons throughout recent years, so draw on those lessons from the pandemic to make sure you have effective communication structures and a nimble strategy for how to make decisions together. Pay attention to who is coming in and out of the building when your community is gathered, and remember the importance of de-escalation as you take your own measures to support the safety of all of the people in your space in these uncertain times.
Also, make sure you connect with your regional staff, other local congregations, and experienced organizers in your own neighborhood. The people who will be most equipped to lead in the event of post-election chaos and conflict are those who have lived experiences of the state not being the primary source of their community's safety. People used to moving in coalition, responding strategically under pressure, and seriously taking into account the needs and the safety of a wide variety of people. If you haven't already, have conversations now about whose leadership and analysis you're going to look to for guidance.
Stride with Love is actively working with our strategic partners, our Unitarian Universalist State Action Networks, and our UUA colleagues to provide you all with timely tools, trainings, and resources to protect our elections and to protect our communities. Those tools include ways to assess threats, de-escalate conflict, and leverage our spiritual and physical assets in this critical time. I know many of you are already doing your part to meet this moment and build resilient communities. And we welcome you all to visit the UUA's new Community Resilience Hub at uua.org/community-resilience-hub. Check in often for updates, new resources, and events that will be added on an ongoing basis. Together, we can harness our power to meet this moment, because democracy isn't just what we do, it is who we are and who we want to be together.
In the coming time, we are going to face many decisions about how we show up publicly, how we protect those who are most vulnerable, and what the most faithful and strategic expression of our values will be. We'll be doing all of this in a range of uncertain and rapidly evolving contexts. Sometimes this will mean bold, prophetic public action. Other moments will demand low ego, low visibility commitment. We must lean into the relationships of accountability and trust within our congregations, among our communities, and across our association to meet this moment with the wisdom and courage that will be required of us.
Friends, it is important to note that justice is not only what love looks like in public, or that it is the essence of the beloved community, but it is also a bridge that draws us out of our UU congregations into the public square, into the public community. As our shared language of the shared value states, quote, "We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions within our congregations, our association, and in society at large," end quote. Essentially, we Unitarian Universalists have drawn a line of connection and interdependence between our work of justice and the work of democracy, noting that they are mutually reinforcing and the absence of one results in the degradation of the other. And in the long haul work of democracy, just as with the moral arc of the universe, what we need to get there to sustain and expand its access to all are tools that are not flashy, but reliable, not forceful, but persuasive, not temporary, but lasting. When I look around at our tools for co-creating such a lasting, ever-expanding democracy and a justice that is accessible to widening circles of not only our shared humanity, but our shared ecology, there is nothing more valuable to us than love. As we seek an end to an immoral chapter of political chaos and cruelty, love can and will guide us. Well, how do I know this? Well, love and justice has done so time and time again. They have a track record, a world record, really, and a national record, a congregational record. I bet even some of you have a personal record in each of your lives with love, too. I'll give one example from our shared lives together. Again, we can hop in our time machines and go not 8 years ago, but just 4.5 years ago. Do you remember where you were? Well, I do. You were at home. We all were. And we were similarly uncertain with what the future would bring. We were living on a razor's edge with the novel coronavirus or COVID-19, upending everything we took for granted in our lives. Suddenly, health and public health, the individual and the community, the one and the many, were oh so clearly interdependent. We also saw deeply what happens when there was a failure of moral leadership to protect our fragile, beloved community. Here at UCCI, we were at the beginning of what would come to be a long journey of moral transformation, wherein we have doubled down on our sense of justice with our commitment to interdependence, and in turn, targeted that towards our collective liberation. We said, if we want to go fast, we can go alone, but we want to go together. And so we want to go far together. So we chose to slow down. We chose to slow down, look around, and consider what justice would look like collectively and in public. We asked, how could we do right by one another? In April of 2020, I co-led a service titled Never Turning Back with Nicole Wiltrout. We spoke together on our Zooms of the naive but expected turning point we were approaching, where the pandemic would crest and we would start going back to normal. It would start to recede. Oh, wow, were we wrong? But nevertheless, we had a sense that whatever was to come in the weeks ahead, back in April of 2020, we were not turning back. We were, as the song we just sang suggests, going to keep on moving forward. We also, in those days, if you recall, lifted up a quote that Kate Hyatt found by an artist she was following on Instagram. This quote sort of became our guiding light in the face of uncertainty and the demands of moral leadership, especially at the board. You remember it? If we get this right, we will never go back to normal. If we get this right, we'll never go back to normal. Perhaps this is immediately impactful, hearing it for the first time or being reminded of it today. Or perhaps it's giving you some pause and you need a little more time to chew on it. Regardless, it is a timeless and relevant message for us today, as it would have been in 2016. You see, the trap of the election, as was the case in 2016, is to oversimplify the implications of the result of the election on our ministry and the future of this congregation. Said differently, I agree with each of you that there is a crystal clear, singular outcome that reflects our Unitarian Universalist shared values. However, I would suggest that the need for our ministry and community, our love and justice, there's a need for us to not be outcome determinative. Rather, our hope, courage, resilience, and compassion, our bridge building and peacemaking will be radically needed no matter the outcome next week. We run the risk of presuming, like we did in 2016 or in 2020, that if a certain outcome occurs, we can finally just get back to normal. But my friends, we know that it was not the case. Normal was not as great as it sounds. The normal we would return to, the status quo, has never been sufficient, has never embodied the beloved community fully, as Dr. King or countless others across time immemorial have envisioned. No, we have been called to a greater love, a wider justice, a fuller sense of democracy, which in our resilience is something to which we can yet still strive. A more perfect union, a wider circle of beloved community, a justice that makes the public beautiful and bright and beckoning us on. So when I say if we get this right, we will never go back to normal, I mean that if we awaken and remain awake to the true task of our shared ministry and of our liberal and liberating religious tradition, we will acknowledge, celebrate, or mourn the outcome. We will reorient then and fortify, reminding one another of our most cherished values, and we will get back on the road and keep on moving forward, keep on singing boldly, loudly, forward, joyfully, never turning back, never turning back. The great Northern Irish poet Seamus Heaney reminds us then of this, that if we listen for the outcry and the birth cry, if we look for the new birth of life and possibility, if we fight for these things with love as our steadfast companion, then perhaps it is true that once in a lifetime, justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. May it be so, and amen.